Hi. Today I'm naked because I'm talking about returns. Wait. No, I'm talking about naked returns. I read that wrong. Hang on, let me get dressed. Hi, I'm Jonathan Hall. Today I'm going to talk about naked returns in Go. What is a naked return and why do I hate it? Stay tuned and you'll find out. So here's a really simple example of what a naked return looks like. I'll show you some more examples in a moment, but first, so you understand the concept. A naked return is simply a return statement that implies the values it's returning. In other words, it doesn't explicitly mention the values that are being returned. Here's an example. I know that it's returning an error because that's defined here, but I don't mention the error explicitly. Now, if you haven't seen this before, it might look a bit confusing. But before I get into that, let's talk about why this is permitted, what it is, and so on. Let's jump over to the Go spec. Here's the Go spec. It's a good resource to read. It's fairly readable, actually, even to a fairly lay person. You don't have to be super technical to understand it. You don't need to know compiler details and whatnot. What we're interested in right now, though, is the return statements. Now, the Go spec mentions 3 valid ways to do return statements, and let's look at each one. The first, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you've been using Go at all, is to mention the word return followed by a list of values that you want to return. That's pretty natural. That's kind of the way most languages handle returns. Here's a couple examples. Return 2 returns the value 2. Or if you have multiple return values, you can list those with commas separating them. Straightforward, right? Pretty simple. The second option is that you can sort of do a pass-through from another function. So if you have another function that has the exact same return types and number of return values, you can just call that function and return it. That's simple enough. So here the example is complex function or complex F2 calls complex F1. They have the same function signature, so you can just call F1 rather than explicitly setting F1's complex F1's values to your own temporary variables to return those. So it sort of handles that for you magically in the background. The third option is the one we're talking about today, and this is sort of informally called naked returns or bare returns, and this is the idea of not explicitly mentioning the return values. Let's just read it to be clear what we're talking about. The expression list may be empty. That means expression list meaning the values listed after the word return. If the function's result type specifies names for its result parameters. So here you can see in the example that there are names for the return values, RE and IM in this example. The result parameters act as ordinary local variables, and the function may assign values to them as necessary. The return statement returns the values of these variables. So let's talk about exactly what's happening here. Let me actually show you an example of what this is essentially doing so that it might make a little bit more sense. All right, so here I've made a sort of copy of the foo function from earlier that kind of illustrates what the named variables do. It's not exactly possible to illustrate it exactly because it would be invalid Go code. Now, when you create a named return variable, as I have in the example of foo here, this error variable is automatically created kind of as though it's in a separate scope. I've sort of tried to illustrate that here by creating a separate scope that contains my actual function, and then declaring the error variable outside that scope, but still within the function. So I hope that kind of makes sense. There's kind of an invisible scope that you can't see when you do that. Now, the reason this isn't exactly equivalent is because I can't do a naked return here because my IDE is smart enough to realize that I'm breaking the rules. But if I were allowed to, then these would be more or less the same thing, right? Now we'll get into this magical scope again at the end of the video. But for now, with regard to naked returns, this is what permits a naked return to happen. You have to have that named return value first to even allow a naked return. Now, spoiler alert, I don't like naked returns. I think they're hard to read. I think they make code more confusing, not more usable. Let me illustrate with a few examples. These examples are from some actual production code. So let's just look at these, and hopefully you'll agree that it's less than readable. Yeah, let's dive in. All right, so here's a quick example I found. You can see at the end of this function there's a naked return. And hopefully this helps to illustrate why I don't like naked returns. I don't know what it's returning. I don't see how many arguments it's returning. I don't know what type they are, and I certainly don't know what value they're set to. This makes for debugging and reading the code, in my view, very difficult. So I have to scroll up to the top of the function to see what it's even returning, and now I can see, oh, it's returning a single error value. That still doesn't tell me what it's returning, though. I have to dig further, and I can see that actually the only time error is set is this first time on the first line. So this is the value being returned. This example contains an embedded anonymous function, which makes things a little more confusing because I have other returns here that look like they're probably returning from the parent function, but they aren't. So, you know, if I was reading this code and I came across this, I would probably think that this return statement was returning from the parent function, only to discover that it's actually not. It's returning from this anonymous function that starts right here, which is passed to this execute, and then the execute returns an error, which I presume is this error, but I don't know. It might be something else. Anyway, the point is that the naked return here does not improve clarity, and I think it actually hurts clarity pretty significantly in this particular case. Let's look at some more. All right, so here's another random example. There's a function, it's a couple dozen lines long, that ends with a naked return. Again, I can't tell from looking at this what it's returning, how many arguments of what type or what they're set to. If I scroll to the top, though, I can see that it's returning an int64. Which is a bit confusing because the function is called toUint64, so there's some a misnamed function, but whatever. It doesn't matter for this purpose. The point is, this could, if this was just to say this, it would be more readable. Then I immediately know what the return, how many return arguments there are, and I can see from context very quickly that I'm setting f based on the switch statement. So you know, adding that one character increases the readability of this code drastically, in my opinion. And one last example to consider. Here's another function that has a naked return. Again, I don't know how many arguments there are or of what type and what they're set to. If I scroll up, though, I have to go a large number of lines. It's a pretty long function. And here I can see this one's actually returning two values. One is a Boolean and one is an integer. So let's see what they're set to. I look at has error. That's set here in the middle or here. So that one's set two different places in the middle, and then total is defined. It looks like it is incremented here. Is this a for loop? Yes, it's a for loop. So it's incremented as the for loop executes based on the number of rows returned. And so we're returning whether there was an error and the number of rows we found, apparently. Why not just include those variable names at the bottom, has error, and that would have saved me a fair amount of effort. Obviously, I uncovered the secret in just a few seconds by reading this, but I don't know anybody who enjoys that sort of puzzle solving in the middle of trying to understand some code. So just make your life easier and name your return values, for goodness sake. Get rid of the naked returns. All right, so let's say I've convinced you that naked returns are a bad idea. What can you do about it? You're probably working on a team. Maybe somebody likes naked returns. Maybe somebody doesn't know any better yet. What can you do? Perhaps the easiest thing you can do to avoid naked returns is to not use named return values. In our example here, foo, if I don't use the named return value, then I have no option. I must use explicit return values. So that's one option. Although there are times when named return values are either necessary or advisable, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Probably the best way to avoid naked returns, though, is to use a linter. Now, I've talked about Golang CI lint before in a previous video. Should be a card over here somewhere. Check it out. But it provides a couple different sublinters that will detect naked returns for you. Let's have a look at their documentation. So Golang CI lint has many, many linters. There's two in particular I want to look at. The first one is called naked ret, and it detects naked returns and warns you about them. Now, by default, it only warns you about naked returns on functions with 30 lines or more. And that's a reasonable default, especially if you have people on your team who like naked returns for some reason. At least put a cap on how long the function can be. You shouldn't have to scroll, or not very far, to find the definition of what that function is returning. I think 30 lines is too long. I would put a maximum of like 5 or something like that. But you and your team decide. Ideally, that number should be 0, in my opinion. There should be 0 naked returns, so functions of 0 lines or more should be permitted to have naked returns. You can also do this with the revive sublinter. So let's look at that one. Now, revive contains many linter rules within it, and one of those is called bare return. It looks like by default it's just a warning, but you can escalate that to an error, and I believe you can configure how many lines of function you permit for naked return. So those are 2 options, both within Golang CI lint, that you can use to disable the ability to use naked returns, or at least limit it to functions of a certain length or shorter. So let's talk just a tiny bit more about why it's not enough to just disable or to not use named returns. And the 2 reasons that I know of, that the first one, perhaps most obvious, is if you want to use a deferred statement that references one of the return values. This is really commonly done for panic handling, although there are other use cases as well. Let me show you what that looks like. So here I've added panic handling to my foo function from the example before. And now that named return value is actually required because it's referenced within this deferred function. Remember that secret scope I talked about that's sort of invisible when you use a named return value? It's within that scope that the deferred function executes. All right, so this isn't exactly valid Go code, but it should illustrate what's happening when you use the named return value with a deferred statement. This sort of represents my original function here, right? Where we just set the error to nil and return it, except that rather than returning, I'm just jumping to the end of the block, which is, of course, the next line, and then I execute what is my deferred statement up here. I hope this kind of makes sense to break it up this way. The key is that there's this sort of invisible scope that happens when you use named return variables, and the deferred statement executes outside of that internal scope. And that's why named return variables are required if you want your deferred statement to modify or to reference in any way your return variables. Enough about that. The other reason to use named return variables sometimes is for clarity, especially in your Go doc. If you're using Go doc and it's unclear what your return values are for or what they mean, using named values can be very useful. That's not usually necessary for error because it's pretty typical that you have 1 error returned, although if you ever had 2 errors returned, it might make sense to do that. Let me show an example, though, from one of my open source projects. So this is a CouchDB client interface, and one thing you can do in CouchDB is delete a document. When you delete a document, you have to provide a revision number, and then you get returned a new revision number. So I provide named return values because I think it makes it more clear what this is. If the new rev and error weren't here, I think it would be a little bit ambiguous. What string am I returning from a delete function? I don't think it would be obvious to the consumer of this function or the documentation what it is. Of course, I could spell it out in the description, but that's a little bit harder to consume. You have to dig farther to find it. It doesn't pop up as easily in your IDE and so on and so forth. So this just makes it really clear and obvious to the user of the function, whether they're reading the Go doc or in their IDE, exactly what the return is for. It's especially valuable to do this if you ever have a function that returns multiple values of the same type, say 2 or 3 or 4 strings. What are those strings? Maybe you have a function that returns a username and a password. It would be useful to know which one's which so that the consumer of your function doesn't get them backwards, for example. So these are all cases where using named return values is valuable from a documentation standpoint or a clarity standpoint. But in these cases, I would still encourage you to not use naked returns. Use explicit returns. And I encourage you to enforce that with a linter. So thank you for listening to my little rant about naked returns. I hope you've learned something. Do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Let me know in comments. I'm sure that somebody out there has a strong opinion in favor of naked returns. I'd like to hear what it is. If you're not already subscribed, be sure to hit that button. If you enjoyed this video or learned something, hit like. and I hope to see you next time on Boldly Go.